You'll never guess what happens next. Listen closely.
Chapter: The Monk. Two men lay prone upon the ground, one bathed in blood and motionless, with his face toward the earth. This one was dead. The other leaned against a tree, supported there by the two valets, and was praying fervently, with clasped hands and eyes raised to heaven. He had received a ball in his thigh which had broken the bone. The young men first approached the dead man. "He is a priest," said Bragelonne. "He has worn the tonsure. Oh, the scoundrels, to lift their hands against a minister of God." "Come here, sir," said Urban, an old soldier who had served under the Cardinal Duke in all his campaigns. "Come here. There is nothing to be done with him, whilst we may perhaps be able to save the other." The wounded man smiled sadly. "Save me, oh no," said he, "but help me to die if you can." "Are you a priest?" asked Raoul. "No, sir. I ask, as your unfortunate companion appeared to me to belong to the church." "He is the curate of Bethune, sir, and was carrying the holy vessels belonging to his church, and the treasure of the chapter, to a safe place, the prince having abandoned our town yesterday. And as it was known that bands of the enemy were prowling about the country, no one dared to accompany the good man, so I offered to do so." "And, sir," continued the wounded man, "I suffer much and would like, if possible, to be carried to some house." "Where you can be relieved?" asked De Guiche. "No, where I can confess. But perhaps you are not so dangerously wounded as you think," said Raoul. "Sir," replied the wounded man, "believe me, there is no time to lose. The ball has broken the thigh bone and entered the intestines." "Are you a surgeon?" asked De Guiche. "No, but I know a little about wounds, and mine, I know, is mortal. Try, therefore, either to carry me to some place where I may see a priest, or take the trouble to send one to me here. It is my soul that must be saved. As for my body, it is lost. To die whilst doing a good deed, it is impossible. God will help you." "Gentlemen, in the name of heaven," said the wounded man, collecting all his forces, as if to get up, "let us not lose time in useless words. Either help me to gain the nearest village, or swear to me on your salvation that you will send me the first monk, the first curé, the first priest you may meet. But," he added, in a despairing tone, "perhaps no one will dare to come, for it is known that the Spaniards are ranging through the country, and I shall die without absolution." My God, good God, good God," added the wounded man, in an accent of terror which made the young men shudder. "You will not allow that. That would be too terrible." "Calm yourself, sir," replied De Guiche. "I swear to you, you shall receive the consolation that you ask. Only tell us where we shall find a house at which we can demand aid, and a village from which we can fetch a priest." "Thank you, and God reward you. About half a mile from this, on the same road, there is an inn, and about a mile further on, after leaving the inn, you will reach the village of Grenny. There you must find the curate, or, if he is not at home, go to the convent of the Augustines, which is the last house on the right, and bring me one of the brothers. Monk or priest, it matters not, provided only that he has received from Holy Church the power of absolving in articulo mortis." "Monsieur d'Arminges," said De Guiche, "remain beside this unfortunate man, and see that he is removed as gently as possible. The Vicomte and myself will go and find a priest." "Go, sir," replied the tutor, "but in heaven's name do not expose yourself to danger." "Do not fear. Besides, we are safe for today. You know the axiom, non bis in idem." "Courage, sir," said Raoul to the wounded man. "We are going to execute your wishes." "May heaven prosper you," replied the dying man with an accent of gratitude impossible to describe. The two young men galloped off in the direction mentioned, and in 10 minutes reached the inn. Raoul, without dismounting, called to the host and announced that a wounded man was about to be brought to his house, and begged him in the meantime to prepare everything needful. He desired him also, should he know in the neighborhood any doctor or chirurgeon, to fetch him, taking on himself the payment of the messenger. The host, who saw two young noblemen, richly clad, promised everything they required, and our two cavaliers, after seeing that preparations for the reception were actually begun, started off again and proceeded rapidly toward Grenny. They had gone rather more than a league, and had begun to descry the first houses of the village. the red-tiled roofs of which stood out from the green trees which surrounded them, when, coming toward them mounted on a mule, they perceived a poor monk, whose large hat and gray worsted dress made them take him for an Augustan brother. Chance for once seemed to favor them in sending what they were so assiduously seeking. He was a man about 22 or 23 years old, but who appeared much older from ascetic exercises. His complexion was pale, not of that deadly pallor which is a kind of neutral beauty, but of a bilious yellow hue. His colorless hair was short and scarcely extended beyond the circle formed by the hat around his head, and his light blue eyes seemed destitute of any expression. "Sir," began Raoul with his usual politeness, "are you an ecclesiastic?" "Why do you ask me that?" replied the stranger, with a coolness which was barely civil. "Because we want to know," said De Guiche haughtily. The stranger touched his mule with his heel and continued his way. In a second, De Guiche had sprung before him and barred his passage. "Answer, sir," exclaimed he. "You have been asked politely, and every question is worth an answer. I suppose I am free to say or not to say who I am to two strangers who take a fancy to ask me." It was with difficulty that De Guiche restrained the intense desire he had of breaking the monk's bones. "In the first place," he said, making an effort to control himself, "we are not people who may be treated anyhow. My friend there is the Viscount of Bragelonne, and I am the Count de Guiche. Nor was it from caprice we asked the question, for there is a wounded and dying man who demands the succor of the Church. If you be a priest, I conjure you in the name of humanity to follow me to aid this man. If you be not, it is a different matter, and I warn you in the name of courtesy, of which you appear profoundly ignorant, that I shall chastise you for your insolence." The pale face of the monk became so livid and his smile so strange that Raoul, whose eyes were still fixed upon him, felt as if this smile had struck to his heart like an insult. "He is some Spanish or Flemish spy," said he, putting his hand to his pistol. A glance, threatening and transient as lightning, replied to Raoul. "Well, sir," said De Guiche, "are you going to reply?" "I am a priest," said the young man. "Then, father," said Raoul, forcing himself to convey a respect by speech that did not come from his heart, "if you are a priest, you have an opportunity, as my friend has told you, of exercising your vocation. At the next inn you will find a wounded man, now being attended by our servants, who has asked the assistance of a minister of God." "I will go," said the monk, and he touched his mule. "If you do not go, sir," said De Guiche, "remember that we have 2 steeds able to catch your mule and the power of having you seized wherever you may be, and then I swear your trial will be summary. One can always find a tree and a cord." The monk's eye again flashed, but that was all. He merely repeated his phrase, "I will go," and he went. "Let us follow him," said De Guiche. "It will be the surest plan." "I was about to propose so doing," answered de Bragelonne. In the space of 5 minutes, the monk turned around to ascertain whether he was followed or not. "You see," said Raoul, "we have done wisely." "What a horrible face that monk has," said De Guiche. "Horrible," replied Raoul, "especially in expression." "Yes, yes," said De Guiche, "a strange face. But these monks are subject to such degrading practices. Their fasts make them pale, the blows of the discipline make them hypocrites, and their eyes become inflamed through weeping for the good things of this life we common folk enjoy, but they have lost." "Well," said Raoul, "the poor man will get his priest, but, by heaven, the penitent appears to me to have a better conscience than the confessor. I confess I am accustomed to priests of a very different appearance." "Ah!" exclaimed De Guiche, "you must understand that this is one of those wandering brothers who go begging on the high road until some day a benefice falls down from heaven on them. They are mostly foreigners, Scotch, Irish, or Danish. I have seen them before." "As ugly?" "No, but reasonably hideous. What a misfortune for the wounded man to die under the hands of such a friar." "Pshaw," said De Guiche. "Absolution comes not from him who administers it, but from God. However, for my part, I would rather die unshriven than have anything to say to such a confessor. You are of my opinion, are you not, Viscount? And I see you playing with the pommel of your sword as if you had a great inclination to break the Holy Father's head. Yes, Count, it is a strange thing and one which might astonish you, but I feel an indescribable horror at the sight of yonder man. Have you ever seen a snake rise up on your path? Never, answered De Guiche. Well, it has happened to me to do so in our Blaisois forests, and I remember that the first time I encountered one with its eyes fixed upon me, curled up, swinging its head and pointing its tongue, I remained fixed, pale, and as though fascinated, until the moment when the Comte de la Fère— Your father? Asked De Guiche. No, my guardian, replied Raoul, blushing. Very well. Until the moment when the Comte de la Fère, resumed Raoul, said, Come, Bragelonne, draw your sword. Then only I rushed upon the reptile and cut it in two, just at the moment when it was rising on its tail and hissing, ere it sprang upon me. Well, I vow I felt exactly the same sensation at sight of that man when he said, Why do you ask me that? And looked so strangely at me. Then you regret that you did not cut your serpent in two morsels. Faith, yes, almost, said Raoul. They had now arrived within sight of the little inn, and could see on the opposite side the procession bearing the wounded man and guided by Monsieur d'Arminges. The youths spurred on. There is the wounded man, said De Guiche, passing close to the Augustine brother. Be good enough to hurry yourself a little, Monsieur Monk. As for Raoul, he avoided the monk by the whole width of the road and passed him, turning his head away in repulsion. The young men rode up to the wounded man to announce that they were followed by the priest. He raised himself to glance in the direction which they pointed out, saw the monk, and fell back upon the litter, his face illumined by joy. And now, said the youths, we have done all we can for you, and as we are in haste to rejoin the prince's army, we must continue our journey. You will excuse us, sir, but we are told that a battle is expected, and we do not wish to arrive the day after it. Go, my young sirs, said the sick man, and may you both be blessed for your piety. You have done for me, as you promised, all that you could do. As for me, I can only repeat, may God protect you and all dear to you. Sir, said De Guiche to his tutor, we will precede you, and you can rejoin us on the road to Cambrin. The host was at his door, and everything was prepared, bed, bandages, and lint, and a groom had gone to Lens, the nearest village, for a doctor. Everything, said he to Raoul, shall be done as you desire, but you will not stop to have your wound dressed? Oh, my wound, mine. 'Tis nothing, replied the Viscount. It will be time to think about it when we next halt. Only have the goodness, should you see a cavalier who makes inquiries about a young man on a chestnut horse followed by a servant, to tell him, in fact, that you have seen me, but that I have continued my journey and intend to dine at Mazingarbe and to stop at Cambrin. This cavalier is my attendant. Would it not be safer and more certain if I should ask him his name and tell him yours? Demanded the host. There is no harm in over-precaution. I am the Viscount de Bragelonne, and he is called Grimaud. At this moment, the wounded man arrived from one direction and the monk from the other, the latter dismounting from his mule and desiring that it should be taken to the stables without being unharnessed. Sir Monk, said De Guiche, confess well that brave man, and be not concerned for your expenses or for those of your mule. All is paid. Thanks, monsieur, said the monk, with one of those smiles that made Bragelonne shudder. Come, Count, said Raoul, who seemed instinctively to dislike the vicinity of the Augustin. Come, I feel ill here, and the two young men spurred on. The litter, borne by two servants, now entered the house. The host and his wife were standing on the steps, whilst the unhappy man seemed to suffer dreadful pain, and yet to be concerned only to know if he was followed by the monk. At sight of this pale, bleeding man, the wife grasped her husband's arm. Well, what's the matter? Asked the latter. Are you going to be ill just now? No, but look, replied the hostess, pointing to the wounded man. I ask you if you recognize him? That man, wait a bit. Ah, I see you know him, exclaimed the wife, for you have become pale in your turn. Truly, cried the host, misfortune is coming on our house. It is the former executioner of Bethune. The former executioner of Bethune, murmured the young monk, shrinking back and showing on his countenance the feeling of repugnance which his penitent inspired. Monsieur d'Arminges, who was at the door, perceived his hesitation. "Sir Monk," said he, "whether he is now or has been an executioner, this unfortunate being is none the less a man. Render to him, then, the last service he can by any possibility ask of you, and your work will be all the more meritorious." The monk made no reply, but silently wended his way to the room where the two valets had deposited the dying man on a bed. D'Arminges and Olivain and the two grooms then mounted their horses, and all four started off at a quick trot to rejoin Raoul and his companion. Just as the tutor and his escort disappeared in their turn, a new traveler stopped on the threshold of the inn. "What does your worship want?" demanded the host, pale and trembling from the discovery he had just made. The traveler made a sign as if he wished to drink, and then pointed to his horse and gesticulated like a man who is brushing something. "Ah, diable," said the host to himself, "this man seems dumb, and where will your worship drink?" "There," answered the traveler, pointing to the table. "I was mistaken," said the host. "He's not quite dumb, and what else does your worship wish for?" "To know if you have seen a young man pass, 15 years of age, mounted on a chestnut horse and followed by a groom." "The Viscount de Bragelonne." "Just so. Then you are called Monsieur Grimaud?" The traveler made a sign of assent. "Well then," said the host, "your young master was here a quarter of an hour ago. He will dine at Mazingarbe and sleep at Cambrin." "How far is Mazingarbe?" 2 miles and a half. "Thank you." Grimaud was drinking his wine silently and had just placed his glass on the table to be filled a second time when a terrific scream resounded from the room occupied by the monk and the dying man. Grimaud sprang up. "What is that?" said he. "Whence comes that cry?" "From the wounded man's room," replied the host. "What wounded man?" "The former executioner of Bethune, who has just been brought in here, assassinated by Spaniards, and who is now being confessed by an Augustine friar." "The old executioner of Bethune," muttered Grimaud. "A man between 55 and 60, tall, strong, swarthy, black hair and beard." "That is he, except that his beard has turned gray and his hair is white. Do you know him?" asked the host. "I have seen him once," replied Grimaud, a cloud darkening his countenance at the picture, so suddenly summoned to the bar of recollection. At this instant a second cry, less piercing than the first, but followed by prolonged groaning, was heard. The three listeners looked at one another in alarm. "We must see what it is," said Grimaud. "It sounds like the cry of one who is being murdered," murmured the host. "Mon Dieu," said the woman, crossing herself. If Grimaud was slow in speaking, we know that he was quick to act. He sprang to the door and shook it violently, but it was bolted on the other side. "Open the door," cried the host. "Open it instantly, Sir Monk." No reply. "Unfasten it, or I will break it in," said Grimaud. The same silence, and then, ere the host could oppose his design, Grimaud seized a pair of pincers he perceived in a corner and forced the bolt. The room was inundated with blood, dripping from the mattresses upon which lay the wounded man, speechless. The monk had disappeared. "The monk!" cried the host. "Where is the monk?" Grimaud sprang toward an open window which looked into the courtyard. "He has escaped by this means," exclaimed he. "Do you think so?" said the host, bewildered. "Boy, see if the mule belonging to the monk is still in the stable." "There is no mule," cried he to whom this question was addressed. The host clasped his hands and looked around him suspiciously, whilst Grimaud knit his brows and approached the wounded man, whose worn, hard features awoke in his mind such awful recollections of the past. "There can be no longer any doubt but that it is himself," said he. "Does he still live?" inquired the innkeeper. Making no reply, Grimaud opened the poor man's jacket to feel if the heart beat, whilst the host approached in his turn. But in a moment they both fell back, the host uttering a cry of horror and Grimaud becoming pallid. The blade of a dagger was buried up to the hilt in the left side of the executioner. "Run, run for help!" cried Grimaud, "and I will remain beside him here." The host quitted the room in agitation, and as for his wife, she had fled at the sound of her husband's cries. Chapter: The Absolution. This is what had taken place. We have seen that it was not of his own free will, but on the contrary, very reluctantly, that the monk attended the wounded man who had been recommended to him in so strange a manner. Perhaps he would have sought to escape by flight had he seen any possibility of doing so. He was restrained by the threats of the two gentlemen and by the presence of their attendants, who doubtless had received their instructions. And besides, he considered it most expedient, without exhibiting too much ill will, to follow to the end his role as confessor. The monk entered the chamber and approached the bed of the wounded man. The executioner searched his face with the quick glance peculiar to those who are about to die and have no time to lose. He made a movement of surprise and said, "Father, you are very young." "Men who bear my robe have no age," replied the monk dryly. "Alas, speak to me more gently, Father. In my last moments, I need a friend." "Do you suffer much?" asked the monk. "Yes, but in my soul much more than in my body." "We will save your soul," said the young man. "But are you really the executioner of Bethune, as these people say?" "That is to say," eagerly replied the wounded man, who doubtless feared that the name of executioner would take from him the last help that he could claim. "That is to say, I was, but am no longer. It is 15 years since I gave up the office. I still assist at executions, but no longer strike the blow myself. No, indeed." "You have, then, a repugnance to your profession." "So long as I struck in the name of the law and of justice, my profession allowed me to sleep quietly, sheltered as I was by justice and law. But since that terrible night when I became an instrument of private vengeance, and when with personal hatred I raised the sword over one of God's creatures, since that day—" The executioner paused and shook his head with an expression of despair. "Tell me about it," said the monk, who, sitting on the foot of the bed, began to be interested in a story so strangely introduced. "Ah!" cried the dying man, with all the effusiveness of a grief declared after long suppression. "Ah! I have sought to stifle remorse by 20 years of good deeds. I have assuaged the natural ferocity of those who shed blood. On every occasion I have exposed my life to save those who were in danger, and I have preserved lives in exchange for that I took away. That is not all. The money gained in the exercise of my profession I have distributed to the poor. I have been assiduous in attending church, and those who formerly fled from me have become accustomed to seeing me. All have forgiven me. Some have even loved me. But I think that God has not pardoned me, for the memory of that execution pursues me constantly, and every night I see that woman's ghost rising before me." "A woman? You have assassinated a woman, then?" cried the monk. "You also," exclaimed the executioner. "You use that word which sounds ever in my ears. Assassinated. I have assassinated, then, and not executed. I am an assassin, then, and not an officer of justice," and he closed his eyes with a groan. The monk doubtless feared that he would die without saying more, for he exclaimed eagerly, "Go on, I know nothing as yet. When you have finished your story, God and I will judge." "Oh, Father," continued the executioner, without opening his eyes, as if he feared on opening them to see some frightful object, "it is especially when night comes on, and when I have to cross a river, that this terror which I have been unable to conquer comes upon me. It then seems as if my hand grew heavy, as if the cutlass was still in its grasp, as if the water had the color of blood, and all the voices of nature, the whispering of the trees, the murmur of the wind, the lapping of the wave, united in a voice tearful, despairing, terrible, crying to me, 'Place for the justice of God.'" "Delirium," murmured the monk, shaking his head. The executioner opened his eyes, turned toward the young man, and grasped his arm. "Delirium," he repeated. "Delirium, do you say? Oh no, I remember too well. It was evening. I had thrown the body into the river, and those words which my remorse repeats to me are those which I in my pride pronounced. After being the instrument of human justice, I aspired to be that of the justice of God." "But let me see, how was it done? Speak," said the monk. "It was at night. A man came to me and showed me an order, and I followed him. 4 other noblemen awaited me. They led me away masked. I reserved the right of refusing if the office they required of me should seem unjust. We traveled 5 or 6 leagues, serious, silent, and almost without speaking. At length, through the window of a little hut, they showed me a woman sitting, leaning on a table, and said, "There is the person to be executed." "Horrible," said the monk, "and you obeyed?" "Father, that woman was a monster. It was said that she had poisoned her second husband. She had tried to assassinate her brother-in-law. She had just poisoned a young woman who was her rival, and before leaving England, she had, it was believed, caused the favorite of the king to be murdered." "Buckingham!" cried the monk. "Yes, Buckingham. The woman was English, then?" "No, she was French, but she had married in England." The monk turned pale, wiped his brow, and went and bolted the door. The executioner thought that he had abandoned him and fell back, groaning, upon his bed. "No, no, I am here," said the monk, quickly coming back to him. "Go on, who were those men?" "One of them was a foreigner, English, I think. The four others were French and wore the uniform of Musketeers." "Their names?" asked the monk. "I don't know them, but the four other noblemen called the Englishman my lord." "Was the woman handsome?" "Young and beautiful. Oh yes, especially beautiful. I see her now, as on her knees at my feet with her head thrown back she begged for life. I have never understood how I could have laid low a head so beautiful with a face so pale." The monk seemed agitated by a strange emotion. He trembled all over. He seemed eager to put a question which yet he dared not ask. At length, with a violent effort at self-control, "The name of that woman?" he said. "I don't know what it was. As I have said, she was twice married, once in France, the second time in England." "She was young, you say?" 25 years old. Beautiful. Ravishingly. "Yes." "Abundance of hair, falling over her shoulders?" "Yes." "Eyes of an admirable expression." "When she chose—" "Oh yes, it is she." "A voice of strange sweetness." "How do you know it?" The executioner raised himself on his elbow and gazed with a frightened air at the monk, who became livid. "And you killed her?" the monk exclaimed. "You were the tool of those cowards who dared not kill her themselves? You had no pity for that youthfulness, that beauty, that weakness? You killed that woman?" "Alas, I have already told you, father, that woman, under that angelic appearance, had an infernal soul, and when I saw her, when I recalled all the evil she had done to me—" "To you? What could she have done to you? Come, tell me." "She had seduced and ruined my brother, a priest. She had fled with him from her convent." "With your brother?" "Yes, my brother was her first lover, and she caused his death. Oh, father, do not look in that way at me. Oh, I am guilty then. You will not pardon me." The monk recovered his usual expression. "Yes, yes," he said. "I will pardon you if you tell me all." "Oh," cried the executioner, "all." "Answer, then. If she seduced your brother, you said she seduced him, did you not?" "Yes." "If she caused his death, you said that she caused his death?" "Yes," repeated the executioner. "Then you must know what her name was as a young girl." "Oh, mon Dieu," cried the executioner, "I think I am dying. Absolution, father, absolution." "Tell me her name, and I will give it." "Her name was—" "My God, have pity on me," murmured the executioner, and he fell back on the bed, pale, trembling, and apparently about to die. "Her name," repeated the monk, bending over him as if to tear from him the name if he would not utter it. "Her name! Speak, or no absolution." The dying man collected all his forces. The monk's eyes glittered. "Anne de Bueil," murmured the wounded man. "Anne de Bueil," cried the monk, standing up and lifting his hands to heaven. "Anne de Bueil. You said Anne de Bueil, did you not?" "Yes, yes, that was her name, and now absolve me, for I am dying." "I absolve you," cried the priest, with a laugh which made the dying man's hair stand on end. "I absolve you? I am not a priest." "You are not a priest," cried the executioner. "What then are you?" "I am about to tell you, wretched man." "Oh, mon Dieu!" "I am John Francis de Winter." "I do not know you," said the executioner. Wait, you are going to know me. I am John Francis de Winter," he repeated, "and that woman—" "Well, that woman was my mother." The executioner uttered the first cry, that terrible cry which had been first heard. "Oh, pardon me," he murmured, "if not in the name of God, at least in your own name. if not as priest, then as son. "Pardon you," cried the pretended monk. "Pardon you. Perhaps God will pardon you, but I never." "For pity's sake," said the executioner, extending his arms. "No pity for him who had no pity. Die, impenitent, die in despair, die and be damned." And drawing a poniard from beneath his robe, he thrust it into the breast of the wounded man, saying, "Here is my absolution." Then was heard that second cry, not so loud as the first, and followed by a long groan. The executioner, who had lifted himself up, fell back upon his bed. As to the monk, without withdrawing the poniard from the wound, he ran to the window, opened it, leaped out into the flowers of a small garden, glided onward to the stable, took out his mule, went out by a back gate, ran to a neighboring thicket, threw off his monkish garb, took from his valise the complete habiliment of a cavalier, clothed himself in it, went on foot to the first post, secured there a horse, and continued with a loose rein his journey to Paris. Chapter. Grimaud speaks. Grimaud was left alone with the executioner, who in a few moments opened his eyes. "Help, help," he murmured. "O God, have I not a single friend in the world who will aid me either to live or to die?" "Take courage," said Grimaud. "They are gone to find assistance." "Who are you?" asked the wounded man, fixing his half-opened eyes on Grimaud. "An old acquaintance," replied Grimaud. "You?" And the wounded man sought to recall the features of the person now before him. "Under what circumstances did we meet?" he asked again. "One night, 20 years ago, my master fetched you from Bethune and conducted you to Musketeers." "I know you well now," said the executioner. "You were one of the 4 grooms." "Just so. Where do you come from now?" "I was passing by and drew up at this inn to rest my horse. They told me the executioner of Bethune was here and wounded when you uttered 2 piercing cries. At the first we ran to the door, and at the second forced it open." "And the monk?" exclaimed the executioner. "Did you see the monk?" "What monk?" "The monk that was shut in with me." "No, he was no longer here. He appears to have fled by the window. Was he the man that stabbed you?" "Yes," said the executioner. Grimaud moved as if to leave the room. "What are you going to do?" asked the wounded man. "He must be apprehended." "Do not attempt it. He has revenged himself and has done well. Now I may hope that God will forgive me, since my crime is expiated." "Explain yourself," said Grimaud. "The woman whom you and your masters commanded me to kill." "Milady?" "Yes, Milady. It is true you called her thus." "What has the monk to do with this Milady?" "She was his mother." Grimaud trembled and stared at the dying man in a dull and leaden manner. "His mother," he repeated. "Yes, his mother. But does he know this secret, then?" "I mistook him for a monk and revealed it to him in confession." "Unhappy man," cried Grimaud, whose face was covered with sweat at the bare idea of the evil results such a revelation might cause. "Unhappy man, you named no one, I hope?" "I pronounced no name, for I knew none, except his mother's, as a young girl, and it was by this name that he recognized her, but he knows that his uncle was among her judges." Thus speaking, he fell back exhausted. Grimaud, wishing to relieve him, advanced his hand toward the hilt of the dagger. "Touch me not," said the executioner. "If this dagger is withdrawn, I shall die." Grimaud remained with his hand extended. Then, striking his forehead, he exclaimed, "Oh, if this man should ever discover the names of the others, my master is lost." "Haste, haste to him and warn him," cried the wounded man. "If he still lives, warn his friends too. My death, believe me, will not be the end of this atrocious misadventure." "Where was the monk going?" asked Grimaud. "Toward Paris." "Who stopped him?" "2 young gentlemen who were on their way to join the army, and the name of one of whom I heard his companion mention, the Viscount de Bragelonne." "And it was this young man who brought the monk to you? Then it was the will of God that it should be so, and this it is which makes it all so awful," continued Grimaud. "And yet that woman deserved her fate. Do you not think so?" "On one's deathbed, the crimes of others appear very small in comparison with one's own," said the executioner, and falling back exhausted, he closed his eyes. Grimaud was reluctant to leave the man alone, and yet he perceived the necessity of starting at once, to bear these tidings to the Comte de la Fère. Whilst he thus hesitated, the host re-entered the room, followed not only by a surgeon, but by many other persons, whom curiosity had attracted to the spot. The surgeon approached the dying man, who seemed to have fainted. "We must first extract the steel from the side," said he, shaking his head in a significant manner. The prophecy which the wounded man had just uttered recurred to Grimaud, who turned away his head. The weapon, as we have already stated, was plunged into the body to the hilt, and as the surgeon, taking it by the end, drew it forth, the wounded man opened his eyes and fixed them on him in a manner truly frightful. When at last the blade had been entirely withdrawn, a red froth issued from the mouth of the wounded man, and a stream of blood spouted afresh from the wound when he at length drew breath. Then, fixing his eyes upon Grimaud with a singular expression, the dying man uttered the last death rattle and expired. Then Grimaud, lifting the dagger from the pool of blood which was gliding along the room, to the horror of all present, made a sign to the host to follow him, paid him with a generosity worthy of his master, and again mounted his horse. Grimaud's first intention had been to return to Paris, but he remembered the anxiety which his prolonged absence might occasion Raoul, and reflecting that there were now only 2 miles between the Vicomte and himself, and a quarter of an hour's riding would unite them, and that the going, returning, and explanation would not occupy an hour, he put spurs to his horse, and a few minutes after had reached the only inn of Mazingarbe. Raoul was seated at table with the Count de Guiche and his tutor, when all at once the door opened, and Grimaud presented himself, travel-stained, dirty, and sprinkled with the blood of the unhappy executioner. "Grimaud, my good Grimaud," exclaimed Raoul, "here you are at last. Excuse me, sirs, this is not a servant, but a friend. How did you leave the Count?" continued he. "Does he regret me a little? Have you seen him since I left him? Answer, for I have many things to tell you too. Indeed, the last 3 days some odd adventures have happened. But what is the matter? How pale you are, and blood too. What is this?" "It is the blood of the unfortunate man whom you left at the inn and who died in my arms." "In your arms, that man? But know you who he was?" "He used to be the headsman of Bethune." "You knew him, and he is dead?" "Yes." "Well, sir," said Darmanges, "it is the common lot. Even an executioner is not exempted. I had a bad opinion of him the moment I saw his wound, and since he asked for a monk, you know that it was his opinion, too, that death would follow." At the mention of the monk, Grimaud became pale. Come, continued Darmanges, "to dinner." For like most men of his age and generation, he did not allow sentiment or sensibility to interfere with a repast. "You are right, sir," said Raoul. "Come, Grimaud, order dinner for yourself, and when you have rested a little, we can talk." "No, sir, no," said Grimaud. "I cannot stop a moment. I must start for Paris again immediately." "What? You start for Paris? You are mistaken. It is Olivine who leaves me. You are to remain." "On the contrary, Olivine is to stay and I am to go. I have come for nothing else but to tell you so." "But what is the meaning of this change?" "I cannot tell you." "Explain yourself." "I cannot explain myself." "Come, tell me, what is the joke?" "Monsieur le Vicomte knows that I never joke." "Yes, but I know also that Monsieur le Comte de la Fère arranged that you were to remain with me and that Olivine should return to Paris. I shall follow the Count's directions." "Not under present circumstances, monsieur." "Perhaps you mean to disobey me?" "Yes, monsieur, I must." "You persist, then?" "Yes, I am going. May you be happy, monsieur." And Grimaud saluted and turned toward the door to go out. Raoul, angry and at the same time uneasy, ran after him and seized him by the arm. "Grimaud," he cried, "remain, I wish it." "Then," replied Grimaud, "you wish me to allow Monsieur le Comte to be killed." He saluted and made a movement to depart. "Grimaud, my friend," said the Viscount, "will you leave me thus, in such anxiety? Speak, in heaven's name." And Raoul fell back trembling upon his chair. "I can tell you but one thing, sir, for the secret you wish to know is not my own. You met a monk, did you not?" "Yes." The young men looked at each other with an expression of fear. "You conducted him to the wounded man, and you had time to observe him, and perhaps you would know him again were you to meet him." "Yes, yes," cried both young men. "Very well. If ever you meet him again, wherever it may be, whether on the high road or in the street or in a church, anywhere that he or you may be, put your foot on his neck and crush him without pity, without mercy, as you would crush a viper or a scorpion. Destroy him utterly and quit him not until he is dead. The lives of 5 men are not safe, in my opinion, as long as he is on the earth." And without adding another word, Grimaud, profiting by the astonishment and terror into which he had thrown his auditors, rushed from the room. 2 minutes later, the thunder of a horse's hoofs was heard upon the road. It was Grimaud, on his way to Paris. When once in the saddle, Grimaud reflected on 2 things. First, that at the pace he was going, his horse would not carry him 10 miles, and secondly, that he had no money. But Grimaud's ingenuity was more prolific than his speech, and therefore at the first halt he sold his steed, and with the money obtained from the purchase, took post horses. Chapter 14. On the Eve of Battle. Raoul was aroused from his somber reflections by his host, who rushed into the apartment crying out, "The Spaniards! The Spaniards!" That cry was of such importance as to overcome all preoccupation. The young men made inquiries and ascertained that the enemy was advancing by way of Houdin and Bethune. While Monsieur d'Arminges gave orders for the horses to be made ready for departure, the 2 young men ascended to the upper windows of the house and saw in the direction of Marsan and of Lens a large body of infantry and cavalry. This time it was not a wandering troop of partisans, it was an entire army. There was therefore nothing for them to do but to follow the prudent advice of Monsieur d'Arminges and beat a retreat. They quickly went downstairs. Monsieur d'Arminges was already mounted. Olivain had ready the horses of the young men, and the lackeys of the Count de Guiche guarded carefully between them the Spanish prisoner, mounted on a pony which had been bought for his use. As a further precaution, they had bound his hands. The little company started off at a trot on the road to Cambrin, where they expected to find the prince. But he was no longer there, having withdrawn on the previous evening to La Bessée, misled by false intelligence of the enemy's movements. Deceived by this intelligence, he had concentrated his forces between Vieille-Chapelle and Laventie, and after a reconnaissance along the entire line, in company with Marshal de Gramont, he had returned and seated himself before a table with his officers around him. He questioned them as to the news they had each been charged to obtain, but nothing positive had been learned. The hostile army had disappeared 2 days before and seemed to have gone out of existence. Now, an enemy is never so near and consequently so threatening as when he has completely disappeared. The prince was, therefore, contrary to his custom, gloomy and anxious, when an officer entered and announced to Marshal de Gramont that someone wished to see him. The Duc de Gramont received permission from the prince by a glance and went out. The prince followed him with his eyes and continued looking at the door. No one ventured to speak for fear of disturbing him. Suddenly, a dull and heavy noise was heard. The prince leaped to his feet, extending his hand in the direction whence came the sound. There was no mistaking it. It was the noise of cannon. Everyone stood up. At that moment the door opened. "Monseigneur," said Marshal de Gramont with a radiant face, "will your highness permit my son, Count de Guiche, and his traveling companion, Viscount de Bragelonne, to come in and give news of the enemy whom they have found while we were looking for him?" "What?" eagerly replied the prince. "Will I permit? I not only permit, I desire. Let them come in." The marshal introduced the 2 young men and placed them face to face with the prince. "Speak, gentlemen," said the prince, saluting them. "First speak. We shall have time afterward for the usual compliments. The most urgent thing now is to learn where the enemy is and what he is doing." It fell naturally to the Count de Guiche to make reply. Not only was he the elder, but he had been presented to the prince by his father. Besides, he had long known the prince, whilst Raoul now saw him for the first time. He therefore narrated to the prince what they had seen from the inn at Mazingarbe. Meanwhile, Raoul closely observed the young general, already made so famous by the battles of Rocroi, Fribourg, and Nordlingen. Louis de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, who since the death of his father, Henri de Bourbon, was called, in accordance with the custom of that period, Monsieur le Prince, was a young man, not more than 26 or 27 years old, with the eye of an eagle, ag occhi grifani, as Dante says, aquiline nose, long, waving hair, of medium height, well-formed, possessed of all the qualities essential to the successful soldier, that is to say, the rapid glance, quick decision, fabulous courage. At the same time, he was a man of elegant manners and strong mind, so that in addition to the revolution he had made in war, by his new contributions to its methods, he had also made a revolution at Paris, among the young noblemen of the court, whose natural chief he was, and who, in distinction from the social leaders of the ancient court, modeled after Bassompierre, Bellegarde, and the Duc d'Angoulême, were called the Petit Maître. At the first words of the Count de Guiche, the prince, having in mind the direction whence came the sound of cannon, had understood everything. The enemy was marching upon Lens, with the intention, doubtless, of securing possession of that town and separating from France the army of France. But in what force was the enemy? Was it a corps sent out to make a diversion? Was it an entire army? To this question de Guiche could not respond. Now, as these questions involved matters of gravest consequence, it was these to which the prince had especially desired an answer, exact, precise, positive. Raoul conquered the very natural feeling of timidity he experienced, and approaching the prince. "My lord," he said, "will you permit me to hazard a few words on that subject, which will perhaps relieve you of your uncertainty?" The prince turned and seemed to cover the young man with a single glance. He smiled on perceiving that he was a child hardly 15 years old. "Certainly, monsieur, speak," he said, softening his stern, accented tones, as if he were speaking to a woman. "My lord," said Raoul, blushing, "might examine the Spanish prisoner." "Have you a Spanish prisoner?" cried the prince. "Yes, my lord." "Ah, that is true," said de Guiche. "I had forgotten it." "That is easily understood. It was you who took him, Count," said Raoul, smiling. The old marshal turned toward the Viscount, grateful for that praise of his son, whilst the prince exclaimed, "The young man is right. Let the prisoner be brought in." Meanwhile, the prince took de Guiche aside and asked him how the prisoner had been taken and who this young man was. "Monsieur," said the prince, turning toward Raoul, "I know that you have a letter from my sister, Madame de Longueville, but I see that you have preferred commending yourself to me by giving me good counsel." "My lord," said Raoul, coloring up, "I did not wish to interrupt your highness in a conversation so important as that in which you were engaged with the count. But here is the letter." "Very well," said the prince. "Give it to me later. Here is the prisoner. Let us attend to what is most pressing." The prisoner was one of those military adventurers who sold their blood to whoever would buy and grew old in stratagems and spoils. Since he had been taken, he had not uttered a word, so that it was not known to what country he belonged. The prince looked at him with unspeakable distrust. "Of what country are you?" asked the prince. The prisoner muttered a few words in a foreign tongue. Ah, it seems that he is a Spaniard. Do you speak Spanish, Gramont?" "Faith, my lord, but indifferently." "And I not at all," said the prince, laughing. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to those who were near him, "can any one of you speak Spanish and serve me as interpreter?" "I can, my lord," said Raoul. "Ah, you speak Spanish? Enough, I think, to fulfill your highness's wishes on this occasion." Meanwhile, the prisoner had remained impassive and as if he had no understanding of what was taking place. "My lord asks of what country you are," said the young man in the purest Castilian. "Ich bin ein Deutscher," replied the prisoner. "What in the devil does he say?" asked the prince. "What new gibberish is that?" "He says he is German, my lord," replied Raoul, "but I doubt it, for his accent is bad and his pronunciation defective." "Then you speak German also?" asked the prince. "Yes, my lord." "Well enough to question him in that language?" "Yes, my lord." "Question him, then." Raoul began the examination, but the result justified his opinion. The prisoner did not understand, or seemed not to understand, what Raoul said to him, and Raoul could hardly understand his replies, containing a mixture of Flemish and Alsatian. However, amidst all the prisoner's efforts to elude a systematic examination, Raoul had recognized his natural accent. Non siete spagnolo, he said. Non siete tedesco, siete italiano. The prisoner started and bit his lips. Ah, that, said the prince. I understand that language thoroughly, and since he is Italian, I will myself continue the examination. Thank you, Viscount, continued the prince, laughing, and I appoint you from this moment my interpreter. But the prisoner was not less unwilling to respond in Italian than in the other languages. His aim was to elude the examination. Therefore, he knew nothing either of the enemy's numbers, or of those in command, or of the purpose of the army. Very good, said the prince, understanding the reason of that ignorance. The man was caught in the act of assassination and robbery. He might have purchased his life by speaking. He doesn't wish to speak. Take him out and shoot him. The prisoner turned pale. The two soldiers who had brought him in took him, each by one arm, and led him toward the door, whilst the prince, turning to Marshal de Grammont, seemed to have already forgotten the order he had given. When he reached the threshold of the door, the prisoner stopped. The soldiers, who knew only their orders, attempted to force him along. "One moment," said the prisoner in French. "I am ready to speak, my lord." Ah, said the prince, laughing. "I thought we should come to that. I have a sure method of limbering tongues. Young men, take advantage of it against the time when you may be in command." "But on condition," continued the prisoner, "that your highness will swear that my life shall be safe." "Upon my honor," said the prince. "Question then, my lord. Where did the army cross the Lys?" "Between Saint Venant and Aire." "By whom is it commanded?" "By Count de Fuensaldana, General Beck, and the Archduke." "Of how many does it consist?" 18,000 men and 36 cannon. "And its aim is?" "Lens. You see, gentlemen," said the prince, turning with a triumphant air toward Marshal de Grammont and the other officers. "Yes, my lord," said the marshal, "you have divined all that was possible to human genius." "Recall Le Plessis, Believe, Villequier, and Derlac," said the prince. "Recall all the troops that are on this side of the Lys. Let them hold themselves in readiness to march tonight. Tomorrow, according to all probability, we shall attack the enemy." "But, my lord," said Marshal de Grammont, "consider that when we have collected all our forces, we shall have hardly 13,000 men." "Monsieur le Maréchal," said the prince, with that wonderful glance that was peculiar to him, "it is with small armies that great battles are won." Then turning toward the prisoner, "Take away that man," he said, "and keep him carefully in sight. His life is dependent on the information he has given us. If it is true, he shall be free. If false, let him be shot." The prisoner was led away. "Count de Guiche," said the prince, "it is a long time since you saw your father. Remain here with him. Monsieur," he continued, addressing Raoul, "if you are not too tired, follow me." "To the end of the world, my lord," cried Raoul, feeling an unknown enthusiasm for that young general, who seemed to him so worthy of his renown. The prince smiled. He despised flatterers, but he appreciated enthusiasts. "Come, monsieur," he said. "You are good in counsel, as we have already discovered. Tomorrow we shall know if you are good in action." "And I," said the marshal, "what am I to do?" "Wait here to receive the troops. I shall either return for them myself or shall send a courier directing you to bring them to me. 20 guards, well mounted, are all that I shall need for my escort." "That is very few," said the marshal. "It is enough," replied the prince. "Have you a good horse, Monsieur de Bragelonne?" "My horse was killed this morning, my lord, and I am mounted provisionally on my lackeys." "Choose for yourself in my stables the horse you like best. No false modesty. Take the best horse you can find. You will need it this evening, perhaps. You will certainly need it tomorrow." Raoul didn't wait to be told twice. He knew that with superiors, especially when those superiors are princes, the highest politeness is to obey without delay or argument. He went down to the stables, picked out a piebald Andalusian horse, saddled and bridled it himself, for Athos had advised him to trust no one with those important offices at a time of danger, and went to rejoin the prince, who at that moment mounted his horse. "Now, monsieur," he said to Raoul. "Will you give me the letter you have brought?" Raoul handed the letter to the prince. "Keep near me," said the latter. The prince threw his bridle over the pommel of the saddle, as he was wont to do when he wished to have both hands free, unsealed the letter of Madame de Longueville, and started at a gallop on the road to Lens, attended by Raoul and his small escort, whilst messengers sent to recall the troops set out with a loose rein in other directions. The prince read as he hastened on. "Monsieur," he said after a moment, "they tell me great things of you. I have only to say, after the little that I have seen and heard, that I think even better of you than I have been told." Raoul bowed. Meanwhile, as the little troop drew nearer to Lens, the noise of the cannon sounded louder. The prince kept his gaze fixed in the direction of the sound with the steadfastness of a bird of prey. One would have said that his gaze could pierce the branches of trees which limited his horizon. From time to time his nostrils dilated as if eager for the smell of powder, and he panted like a horse. At length they heard the cannon so near that it was evident they were within a league of the field of battle, and at a turn of the road they perceived the little village of Aunay. The peasants were in great commotion. The report of Spanish cruelty had gone out, and everyone was frightened. The women had already fled, taking refuge in Vitry. Only a few men remained. On seeing the prince, they hastened to meet him. One of them recognized him. "Ah, my lord," he said, "have you come to drive away those rascal Spaniards and those Lorraine robbers?" "Yes," said the prince, "if you will serve me as guide." "Willingly, my lord. Where does your highness wish to go?" "To some elevated spot whence I can look down on Lens and the surrounding country." "In that case, I'm your man. I can trust you. You are a true Frenchman." "I am an old soldier of Rocroi, my lord." "Here," said the prince, handing him a purse. "Here is for Rocroi. Now, do you want a horse, or will you go afoot?" "Afoot, my lord. I have served always in the infantry. Besides, I expect to lead your highness into places where you will have to walk." "Come then," said the prince. "Let us lose no time." The peasant started off, running before the prince's horse. Then, 100 steps from the village, he took a narrow road hidden at the bottom of the valley. For a half-league they proceeded thus, the cannon shot sounding so near that they expected at each discharge to hear the hum of the balls. At length they entered a path which, going out from the road, skirted the mountainside. The prince dismounted, ordered one of his aides and Raoul to follow his example, and directed the others to await his orders, keeping themselves meanwhile on the alert. He then began to ascend the path. In about 10 minutes, they reached the ruins of an old chateau. Those ruins crowned the summit of a hill which overlooked the surrounding country. At a distance of hardly a quarter of a league, they looked down on Lens, at bay, and before Lens the enemy's entire army. With a single glance, the prince took in the extent of country that lay before him, from Lens as far as Vimy. In a moment, the plan of the battle, which on the following day was to save France the second time from invasion, was unrolled in his mind. He took a pencil, tore a page from his tablets, and wrote, "My dear Marshal, in an hour Lens will be in the enemy's possession. Come and rejoin me. Bring with you the whole army. I shall be at Vendin to place it in position. Tomorrow we shall retake Lens and beat the enemy." Then, turning toward Raoul, "Go, monsieur," he said. "Ride fast and give this letter to Monsieur de Gramont." Raoul bowed, took the letter, went hastily down the mountain, leaped on his horse, and set out at a gallop. A quarter of an hour later, he was with the marshal. A portion of the troops had already arrived, and the remainder was expected from moment to moment. Marshal de Gramont put himself at the head of all the available cavalry and infantry and took the road to Vending, leaving the Duc de Châtillon to await and bring on the rest. All the artillery was ready to move and started off at a moment's notice. It was 7 o'clock in the evening when the marshal arrived at the appointed place. The prince awaited him there. As he had foreseen, Lens had fallen into the hands of the enemy immediately after Raoul's departure. The event was announced by the cessation of the firing. As the shadows of night deepened, the troops summoned by the prince arrived in successive detachments. Orders were given that no drum should be beaten, No trumpet sounded. At 9 o'clock, the night had fully come. Still a last ray of twilight lighted the plain. The army marched silently, the prince at the head of the column. Presently the army came in sight of Lens. 2 or 3 houses were in flames, and a dull noise was heard, which indicated what suffering was endured by a town taken by assault. The prince assigned to every one his post. Marshal de Gramont was to hold the extreme left, resting on Méricourt. The Duc de Châtillon commanded the center. Finally, the prince led the right wing, resting on Aunay. The order of battle on the morrow was to be that of the positions taken in the evening. Each one, on awaking, would find himself on the field of battle. The movement was executed in silence and with precision. At 10 o'clock, everyone was in his appointed position. At 10:30, the prince visited the posts and gave his final orders for the following day. 3 things were especially urged upon the officers, who were to see that the soldiers observed them scrupulously. The first, that the different corps should so march that cavalry and infantry should be on the same line, and that each body should protect its gaps. The second, to go to the charge no faster than a walk. The third, to let the enemy fire first. The prince assigned the Count de Guiche to his father and kept Bragelonne near his own person. But the 2 young men sought the privilege of passing the night together, and it was accorded them. A tent was erected for them near that of the marshal. Although the day had been fatiguing, neither of them was inclined to sleep. And besides, even for old soldiers, the evening before a battle is a serious time. It was so with greater reason to 2 young men who were about to witness for the first time that terrible spectacle. On the evening before a battle, one thinks of 1,000 things forgotten till then. Those who are indifferent to one another become friends, and those who are friends become brothers. It need not be said that if in the depths of the heart there is a sentiment more tender, it reaches then, quite naturally, the highest exaltation of which it is capable. Some sentiment of this kind must have been cherished by each one of these 2 friends, for each of them almost immediately sat down by himself at an end of the tent and began to write. The letters were long. The 4 pages were covered with closely written words. The writers sometimes looked up at each other and smiled. They understood without speaking. Their organizations were so delicate and sympathetic. The letters being finished, each put his own into 2 envelopes, so that no one, without tearing the first envelope, could discover to whom the second was addressed. Then they drew near to each other and smilingly exchanged their letters. "In case any evil should happen to me," said Bragelonne. "In case I should be killed," said de Guiche. They then embraced each other like 2 brothers, and each wrapping himself in his cloak, they soon passed into that kindly sleep of youth, which is the prerogative of birds, flowers, and infants. A dinner in the old style. The second interview between the former musketeers was not so formal and threatening as the first. Athos, with his superior understanding, wisely deemed that the supper table would be the most complete and satisfactory point of reunion, and at the moment when his friends, in deference to his deportment and sobriety, dared scarcely speak of some of their former good dinners, he was the first to propose that they should all assemble around some well-spread table and abandon themselves unreservedly to their own natural character and manners, a freedom which had formerly contributed so much to that good understanding between them which gave them the name of the Inseparables. For different reasons, this was an agreeable proposition to them all, and it was therefore agreed that each should leave a very exact address, and that upon the request of any of the associates, a meeting should be convoked at a famous eating-house in the Rue de la Monnaie of the sign of the Hermitage. The first rendezvous was fixed for the following Wednesday, at 8 o'clock in the evening precisely. On that day, in fact, the 4 friends arrived punctually at the hour, each from his own abode or occupation. Porthos had been trying a new horse. D'Artagnan was on guard at the Louvre. Aramis had been to visit one of his penitents in the neighborhood, and Athos, whose domicile was established in the Rue Guénégaud, found himself close at hand. They were, therefore, somewhat surprised to meet all together at the door of the Hermitage, Athos starting out from the Pont Neuf. Porthos by the Rue de la Rue, D'Artagnan by the Rue de Fos Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, and Aramis by the Rue de Bethisy. The first words exchanged between the four friends, on account of the ceremony which each of them mingled with their demonstration, were somewhat forced, and even the repast began with a kind of stiffness. Athos perceived this embarrassment, and by way of supplying an effectual remedy, called for 4 bottles of champagne. At this order, given in Athos's habitually calm manner, the face of the Gascon relaxed, and Porthos's brow grew smooth. Aramis was astonished. He knew that Athos not only never drank, but more, that he had a kind of repugnance to wine. This astonishment was doubled when Aramis saw Athos fill a bumper and toss it off with all his former enthusiasm. His companions followed his example. In a very few minutes, the 4 bottles were empty, and this excellent specific succeeded in dissipating even the slightest cloud that might have rested on their spirits. Now the 4 friends began to speak loud, scarcely waiting till one had finished before another began, and each assumed his favorite attitude on or at the table. Soon, strange fact, Aramis undid 2 buttons of his doublet, seeing which Porthos unfastened his entirely. Battles, long journeys, blows given and received, sufficed for the first themes of conversation, which turned upon the silent struggle sustained against him who was now called the Great Cardinal. "Faith," said Aramis, laughing, "we have praised the dead enough. Let us revile the living a little. I should like to say something evil of Mazarin. Is it permissible?" Go on," replied D'Artagnan, laughing heartily. "Relate your story, and I will applaud it if it is a good one." "A great prince," said Aramis, "with whom Mazarin sought an alliance, was invited by him to send him a list of the conditions on which he would do him the honor to negotiate with him. The prince, who had a great repugnance to treat with such an ill-bred fellow, made out a list against the grain and sent it. In this list there were 3 conditions which displeased Mazarin, and he offered the prince 10,000 crowns to renounce them. "Ah, ha, ha!" laughed the 3 friends. "Not a bad bargain, and there was no fear of being taken at his word. What did the prince do then?" "The prince immediately sent 50,000 francs to Mazarin, begging him never to write to him again, and offered 20,000 francs more, on condition that he would never speak to him. What did Mazarin do?" "Storm," suggested Athos. "Beat the messenger," cried Porthos. "Accepted the money," said D'Artagnan. "You have guessed it," answered Aramis, and they all laughed so heartily that the host appeared in order to inquire whether the gentlemen wanted anything. He thought they were fighting. At last their hilarity calmed down and— "Faith!" exclaimed D'Artagnan to the 2 friends, "you may well wish ill to Mazarin, for I assure you on his side he wishes you no good." "Pooh, really?" asked Athos. "If I thought the fellow knew me by my name, I would be rebaptized, for fear it might be thought I knew him." "He knows you better by your actions than your name. He is quite aware that there are 2 gentlemen who greatly aided the escape of Monsieur de Beaufort, and he has instigated an active search for them. I can answer for it." "By whom?" "By me, and this morning he sent for me to ask me if I had obtained any information." "And what did you reply?" "That I had none as yet, but that I was to dine today with 2 gentlemen who would be able to give me some." "You told him that?" said Porthos, a broad smile spreading over his honest face. "Bravo! And you are not afraid of that, Athos?" "No," replied Athos. "It is not the search of Mazarin that I fear." "Now," said Aramis, "tell me a little what you do fear." "Nothing for the present, at least nothing in good earnest." "And with regard to the past?" asked Porthos. "Oh, the past is another thing," said Athos, sighing. "The past and the future." "Are you afraid for your young Raoul?" asked Aramis. "Well," said D'Artagnan, "one is never killed in a first engagement." "Nor in the second," said Aramis. "Nor in the third," returned Porthos. "And even when one is killed, one rises again, the proof of which is that here we are." "No," said Athos, "it is not Raoul about whom I am anxious, for I trust he will conduct himself like a gentleman, and if he is killed, well, he will die bravely. But hold, should such a misfortune happen, well—" Athos passed his hand across his pale brow. "Well," asked Aramis. "Well, I shall look upon it as an expiation." Ah, said D'Artagnan, I know what you mean. And I too, added Aramis, but you must not think of that, Athos. What is past is past. I don't understand, said Porthos. The affair at Armentières, whispered D'Artagnan. The affair at Armentières, asked he again. Milady. Oh, yes, said Porthos. True, I had forgotten it. Athos looked at him intently. You have forgotten it, Porthos, said he. Faith, yes, it is so long ago, answered Porthos. This affair does not, then, weigh upon your conscience. And you, D'Artagnan, I own that when my mind returns to that terrible period, I have no recollection of anything but the rigid corpse of poor Madame Bonacieux. Yes, yes, murmured he. I have often felt regret for the victim, but never the very slightest remorse for the assassin. Athos shook his head doubtfully. Consider, said Aramis, if you admit divine justice and its participation in the things of this world, that woman was punished by the will of heaven. We were but the instruments, that is all. But as to free will, Aramis, how acts the judge? He has a free will, yet he fearlessly condemns. What does the executioner? He is master of his arm, yet he strikes without remorse. The executioner, muttered Athos, as if arrested by some recollection. I know that it is terrible, said D'Artagnan, but when I reflect that we have killed English, Rochellais, Spaniards, nay, even French, who never did us any other harm but to aim at and to miss us, whose only fault was to cross swords with us and to be unable to ward off our blows, I can, on my honor, find an excuse for my share in the murder of that woman. As for me, said Porthos, now that you have reminded me of it, Athos, I have the scene again before me, as if I now were there. Milady was there, as it were, where you sit. Athos changed color. I was where D'Artagnan stands. I wore a long sword which cut like a Damascus. You remember it, Aramis, for you always called it Balizard. Well, I swear to you all three that had the executioner of Bethune, was he not of Bethune? Yes, egad of Bethune. Not been there, I would have cut off the head of that infamous being without thinking of it, or even after thinking of it. She was a most atrocious woman. And then, said Aramis, with the tone of philosophical indifference, which he had assumed since he had belonged to the church, and in which there was more atheism than confidence in God, what is the use of thinking of it all? At the last hour we must confess this action, and God knows better than we can whether it is a crime, a fault, or a meritorious deed. I repent of it? Egad, no. Upon my honor and by the Holy Cross, I only regret it because she was a woman. The most satisfactory part of the matter, said D'Artagnan, is that there remains no trace of it. She had a son, observed Athos. Oh, yes, I know that, said D'Artagnan, and you mentioned it to me, but who knows what has become of him? If the serpent be dead, why not its brood? Do you think his uncle De Winter would have brought up that young viper? De Winter probably condemned the son as he had done the mother. Then, said Athos, woe to De Winter, for the child had done no harm. May the devil take me, if the child be not dead, said Porthos. There is so much fog in that detestable country, at least so D'Artagnan declares. Just as the quaint conclusion reached by Porthos was about to bring back hilarity to faces now more or less clouded, hasty footsteps were heard upon the stair, and someone knocked at the door. Come in, cried Athos. Please your honors, said the host. A person in a great hurry wishes to speak to one of you. To which of us? Asked all the four friends. To him who is called the Comte de la Fère. It is I, said Athos, and what is the name of the person? Grimaud. Ah, exclaimed Athos, turning pale. Back already. What can have happened then to Bragelonne? Let him enter, cried D'Artagnan. Let him come up. But Grimaud had already mounted the staircase and was waiting on the last step, so springing into the room, he motioned the host to leave it. The door being closed, the four friends waited in expectation. Grimaud's agitation, his pallor, the sweat which covered his face, the dust which soiled his clothes, all indicated that he was the messenger of some important and terrible news. Your honors, said he, that woman had a child. That child has become a man. The tigress had a little one. The tiger has roused himself. He is ready to spring upon you. Beware. Athos glanced around at his friends with a melancholy smile. Porthos turned to look at his sword, which was hanging on the wall. Aramis seized his knife. D'Artagnan arose. "What do you mean, Grimaud?" he exclaimed. "That Milady's son has left England, that he is in France on his road to Paris, if he be not here already." "The devil he is," said Porthos. "Are you sure of it?" "Certain," replied Grimaud. This announcement was received in silence. Grimaud was so breathless, so exhausted, that he had fallen back upon a chair. Athos filled a beaker with champagne and gave it to him. "Well, after all," said D'Artagnan, "supposing that he lives, that he comes to Paris, we have seen many other such. Let him come." "Yes," echoed Porthos, glancing affectionately at his sword, still hanging on the wall. "We can wait for him. Let him come." "Moreover, he is but a child," said Aramis.
Grimaud rose.
"A child!" he exclaimed. "Do you know what he has done, this child? Disguised as a monk, he discovered the whole history in confession from the executioner of Bethune, and having confessed him, after having learned everything from him, he gave him absolution by planting this dagger into his heart. See, it is on fire yet with his hot blood, for it is not 30 hours since it was drawn from the wound." And Grimaud threw the dagger on the table. D'Artagnan, Porthos, and Aramis rose, and in one spontaneous motion rushed to their swords. Athos alone remained seated, calm and thoughtful. "And you say he is dressed as a monk, Grimaud?" "Yes, as an Augustan monk." "What size man is he?" "About my height, thin, pale, with light blue eyes and tawny flaxen hair." "And he did not see Raoul?" asked Athos. "Yes, on the contrary, they met, and it was the Viscount himself who conducted him to the bed of the dying man." Athos, in his turn, rising without speaking, went and unhooked his sword. "Hi, sir," said D'Artagnan, trying to laugh. "Do you know we look very much like a flock of silly, mouse-evading women? How is it that we, 4 men who have faced armies without blinking, begin to tremble at the mention of a child?" "It is true," said Athos, "but this child comes in the name of heaven." And very soon they left the inn.